You are listening to the IFH Podcast Network. For more amazing filmmaking and screenwriting podcasts, just go to ifhpodcastnetwork.com.
Welcome to Filmmaking Conversations with Damian Swaby. Listen to conversations with award-winning filmmakers, directors from the golden age of television, and creatives from the indie film community who continue to inspire the next generation of filmmakers. And now, over to your host, Damian Swaby.
Today on Filmmaking Conversations, I speak to Christy Cooper, a PhD scientist, documentary filmmaker, and Emmy Award-winning cinematographer. After leaving a successful academic and research career in Europe, Christy gained an MFA in science and natural history filmmaking. She co-created the impactful documentary series Stories of Trust, calling for climate recovery in 2011, highlighting youth plantees suing their state governments over climate change. Her latest feature documentary, Youth v Gov, premiered at Doc NYC, showcasing the extraordinary story of America's youth suing the US government over climate inaction. In addition to her filmmaking, Christy combines her research skills and scientific knowledge to create compelling narratives focused on social political issues and justice. Outside of her personal life, she enjoys being a mother, growing her own food, and embracing the beauty of Montana. Now let's learn more about Christy's incredible journey, her impactful work, and her vision for a more just and sustainable future. Christy, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Damian. How about you?
I'm doing good. For full disclosure, everyone in podcast land, I had a few technical issues getting into the podcast today and hitting the record button, but we've overcome them, and here we are. So I've watched some of your work and I really enjoy what I've seen. I really admire your approach, and I can see the incredible amount of effort that goes into your work. Youth v Gov, the documentary itself, must have taken quite a lot of effort to get going, and everyone involved in it, I really do take my hat off to everyone involved. So
thanks, Damian.
Not a problem at all. Before we speak a bit more about your documentary and climate change and everything else that you've been involved in terms of being a filmmaker, please do tell us about yourself and why exactly did you get involved in documentary filmmaking?
Yeah, so I've kind of had a roundabout, path getting me into this career. I started out as a scientist. I have a PhD in neuroscience, and I worked in Europe for about 18 years as a neuroscientist and preclinical research. And at the time, my focus was in stem cells, and I was working in Germany and Sweden. And because of the nature of the research that I was doing, our research was getting more and more involved in public awareness and communicating about science. And I found myself, not only working in the lab, but also working with the public in trying to tell them stories about the brain and explain how stem cells work, and just basically trying to grow awareness about the topic that I was working on. And it provided a kind of a segue for me in terms of storytelling, and I became very interested in how I could potentially blend my background into the visual arts. So I actually found this amazing program in Montana. It's a MFA in science and natural history filmmaking, and it felt like it was the perfect blend for me to take my scientific background and blend it with being a storyteller, producer, and et cetera. So I made the career switch in 2009 and moved back to the US and got my MFA, and I've been in the documentary world ever since.
Your approach, how has your background as a PhD scientist influenced your approach to storytelling, particularly when it comes to addressing complex issues like climate change or justice through your films?
Yeah, I think the program that I went through, we focused a lot on how do you take very complex stories or very complex information and be able to present it in a way that is entertaining and digestible and has a story arc and has, all of the storytelling elements built into it. And when I first started out in the program, I remember my mentor telling me to stop thinking like a scientist. I think I was very didactic in my, doing. And it was for me so much about educating and getting the point across. And obviously, as storytellers, that's not, you want to show and not tell, right?
Yeah.
You want to pull at heartstrings, and you want to make emotional connections, and not necessarily always just speaking in front of a classroom and telling people what they should know and what they should understand. So for me, I have worked a lot in environmental justice realm, and I think that having a human connection, sometimes we have this really, unfortunately, I think for a long time in nature and environmental realms, it was like nature's over here and humans are over here. And there's very little connection between that. And we look at nature as this thing, we don't exist in it. And so for me, it's been really important to bring that together, because like humans would not exist without our ecosystem functioning, right? We are part of that system, and we need to start thinking about our environment as being our space. Like we're part of that environment. And so I think the best way to connect people to some of these really complex topics is to provide that human connection for them. And so in particular with Youth v. Gov, that was really important to me, that it, the film wasn't just about the legalese. It wasn't just about what was happening in the courtroom, and it wasn't just about what was going on in the case and all of the tenets of the case. But it's really, the heart of the story is about the kids, right? It's about what they're personally experiencing and why they're plaintiffs, why they're going through, and even what their experiences of going through this court case. And I feel like once you have that emotional connection, you're a little bit more invested in understanding the complexity, or the of the information that you're digesting, because it's a little bit more personal, I guess.
When exactly did your scientific foundations allow you to reach out and say to yourself, I want to be a documentary filmmaker?
I think it was living in Sweden and working directly. So I was working in the adult stem cell field, and there's been so much controversy over the last decades about stem cells, and we really discovered that people were eager to have conversations about it, and I joined this force. It was a intersectional grant, EU grant that we received, and we were doing traveling science fairs around Europe. And so, in the process, we were in public museums and talking with the general public who would come by, and we would present things to them, whether it was through video or visual imagery or posters or something, and communicate with them about this. And it became very apparent to me that, particularly in the US, I don't think it's so much the case in Europe, but in the US in particular, we've really lost our ability to like converse about complex topics, and in particular science. Science has been so dumbed down that people can't have philosophical conversations about it, because there's so little base understanding and knowledge about a lot of the general topics. So that was kind of the interest for me, is like I wanted to figure out, how can I make this more entertaining and more presentable and create dialogue.
So why do you believe in America the discussions around this topic are not as maybe as advanced as you would like? And why did you pick the genre documentary filmmaking out of all the genres available?
I think in the US, well, I'll speak first just from the science. We can go back to the H.W. Bush era. And during that time, there was a big push to eliminate a lot of the NIH and NSF funding, which is the funding that provides a lot of the resources for universities and scientific research. And a lot of this funding was cut, which meant there was less funding also for scientific education, less emphasis put on the importance of scientific research. And it's kind of been a slow erosion since then, I think, in the United States, excuse me, in terms of just the importance of having a dialogue around these scientific topics, and knowing that people, like making sure our schools have the resources that they need to be able to teach that science and making it an important. So I think it's been like a slow degradation over the last, 30, 40 years where we really have lost a lot of that cultural connection to those topics. And I think then that blends over into, obviously into political conversations because, whether it's stem cells or it's climate change or, the ecosystem, the environment, so many of these topics now, especially in United States politics, is so interwoven into our policies and our politics and how people are voting. And, it's just like gotten so complex that we're no longer talking about facts anymore. We're talking
Yeah.
about people's beliefs and what value systems they align with.
And value systems. Youth v. Gov, your recent feature documentary, presents a powerful narrative about the youth's legal battle against government inaction on climate change. What inspired you to embark on this project, and how did you navigate the challenge of transforming a legal battle into a compelling story that resonated with such a broad audience?
So back in 2011, I started working on some short films. It was a film project in collaboration with Witness, which is Peter Gabriel's organization based out of New York. And that organization focuses on using film for social change, basically. It was a collaboration between Witness and Our Children's Trust, who is the legal organization that represents these kids in these lawsuits. And I came on as a filmmaker to help create some short films about some of these youth plaintiffs who were suing their state governments. And so it was a series of 10 short films that we did. And those films were used in the courts. And I think it's the first time that documentary has been used in legal cases in the courtroom as evidence because we worked with the kids. They were writers on the films because the films were based on their standing declarations of harm. So we were able to present them to the judges and to the courts as evidence in their cases. So the judges had to watch these short films, which was pretty cool. And then we ended up being able to present DVD the films to President Obama as well. At the time, there was a federal case as well, but that case was quickly dismissed. So this was kind of my introduction to climate litigation and also working with young people. And it was really compelling to me. I felt like there was an opportunity to create change with these stories and also to empower young people, in particular young people who are not old enough yet to vote. So it kind of spoke to a lot of passion, values. I guess when we just go back to values, it spoke to a lot of the stuff that was important to me about our democracy, about youth empowerment and youth movements and you and lawsuit is also so much based on science. And so that was also really compelling to me, or the various lawsuits were. So I stayed in touch with these kids, and when they gathered up enough information and did research and filed this new federal lawsuit, I was already kind of linked in with the kids, with the legal team. When I saw that they had their first win in the spring of 2016, that was when I basically reached out to them and said, I would love to follow this story. Could you give me exclusive access to this? And I had no idea what I was in for, how long the journey would be, how complex it would be, and difficult. And that actually, we're now 9 years in, and these kids are still in their lawsuit, and it's still unresolved, and they still have never gone to trial. So I had no idea that that was all going to be part of this journey, but I was very intrigued by the combination of using storytelling and the law and science in order to move the needle on a subject.
There's such a mix of wonderful young people in the documentary. Is there any of them or anyone in particular in the documentary that you related to more, that you think the audience would also love and appreciate?
So I became close with all of them, over the course of so many years, spending time with them and also traveling to their homes and being with their families, and so many opportunities where we all came together and it felt like this little family. And the plaintiffs themselves are all really close and they come from such diverse backgrounds. I mean, you've got kids come from, farming families, and kids that come from New York City, or down in Louisiana, or all the way up in Alaska and in the Arctic, like super very diverse backgrounds and cultures. But they all came together around this united effort and became so close because of it, and going through it was like they always talked about how they knew that this group was the only group in the world that could relate to what they were going through. It was these 21 kids. So they really relied on each other. And I became close to them. I would say, it's hard to pick one out over the other. Kelsey and I became very close. She always called me her climate mama. And I had also worked with her on the short film. I have known Kelsey for a really long time. I worked on a short film with her back in 2011 and saw her, basically from 15, 16 years on. And now she is almost turning 30. It's kind of crazy. And same thing with Shuteska. I had known him also since back in 2011. I had traveled to Rio de Janeiro with him for Rio Plus 20 for the UN Climate Conference back in 2012. I had formed really deep connections with him and his family. So those are always really special. I think the stories that really resonate with the audience, I mean, they've been varied, but I think Levi, he's so young and he's so charismatic. And I think seeing, this little kid and what he's going through. The same thing with Jaden from Louisiana, losing her best friend over this topic because she's in a lawsuit. I think those were some of the heartstring stories I think that people really related to. We had a lot of kids in all of our community and impact screenings, tell us that it seemed like there was always a kid on the screen that they could relate to, whether they were a kid of color, whether they were a kid from a farming community, whether they were from the city, whether they were a kid who identified as LGBTQ. There was some face or some story that they were able to relate to, and that was not of my doing. That was simply by the fact that these plaintiffs represented just a super diverse group of American kids.
So when you were growing up, if there were a social issue or any kind of issue politically that you had a passion for, were you supported in that situation, or did you have to kind of go it alone and make your own path politically?
Interesting. I'm a kid of the 70s and 80s and Generation X, and I feel like I've talked with other friends of the same generation. At least I don't know what it was like in in Great Britain and Europe at that time, but I feel like we grew up with the parents who had been the activists, right? Like the 60s were so fraught with, protests of Vietnam and women's lib and, equal rights and all of these things that people were fighting for. And when I was a young person, I felt like I grew up in this, I don't know, bubble maybe of thinking that the work had already all been done. Like we'd had, our civil rights movement, we'd had our women's lib movement, we'd had, all these anti-war protests, and our parents and our grandparents had been involved in all of these social justice movements. And I feel like my generation, and I'm speaking very broadly, obviously this doesn't apply to everyone, but certainly in my world, I felt like there wasn't a lot to have to get behind or fight against, or even though racism and all kinds of other oppressions were still happening. But I think there was a little complacency in those couple of decades when I was a kid about thinking that a lot of the work had been done. So I really didn't get so engaged in a lot of social justice and political stuff until later in college. And I think just growing awareness and, traveling and being in other parts of the world and understanding actually what's going on and what's important. So it's strange. I didn't really have that experience of a kid of really trying to navigate that world.
That's understandable. And I'm sure many of the listeners can agree and understand what you mean completely when you say you didn't have those experiences as a kid. But given your award-winning status as a cinematographer, How do you approach the visual aspects of your documentaries to ensure that they have the desired emotion and intellectual impact on your viewers?
That's a good question. I think it's spending a lot of time with your subjects, really diving deep into the story and having an understanding of what you're trying to tell through the camera, through the lens, whether that's action, drama, emotions, etc. So I think I did a lot of photography before I left the scientific world. And my scientific world was also very visual. So a lot of the work that I did was very visually focused. So I grew up in a family of filmmakers and photographers. My grandfather and my uncle in Germany were both documentary filmmakers, and my aunt was a professional photographer. So I kind of grew up with the visuals being, I guess, part of my world, and was always very interested in photography and the visual arts. But yeah, I think it's also being open to critique
Yeah.
in order to kind of hone that, that talent or that expertise that you have. I think it's just really being open to critique and taking that feedback and being able to grow constantly. It's a growth process that I still feel like I'm undergoing.
So are there any particular techniques that you always kind of rely on or have to go to in a certain sense, especially if you're tackling a subject and pressing as politically as climate change? Sorry.
I've worked on projects where super complex gear, and every single time you need to pick up the camera, it's 15 minutes of checking all the batteries, and you've got your camera assistant, and it's very complex and it's very technically driven, and that's not my style. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the all of the I love all the technical stuff, so I really appreciate the art of that. But as a documentary filmmaker, my go-to has been to really be able to run and gun. So
Yeah.
for Youth v Gov, this is a little more technical, but we shot most of the footage on FS7, Sony FS7s. It's an
Nice
easy
one.
camera. It's a
Yeah.
beautiful camera. It's easy to work with in post. You get a really beautiful picture. But the really beautiful part of it is it's so easy to just throw onto your shoulder and go, and you're there. You're always in the moment. You're always able to immediately press record and be there, and you're not encumbered by making sure you've got all the gears and the lights and you've got enough batteries and you've got your camera assistant. So much of the film I shot by myself. I never had a camera assistant, so it was it was imperative that I was able to react and respond and be there, be present with my subject, and not feel like there's this all this technical stuff that is this barrier between me and the story. So I really worked a lot on trying to be nimble and prepared and just ready to go, so that I could have this personal interaction. For instance, with the kids, I could have this personal interaction on a boat with them and not feel like we've got all this gear that's interrupting and maybe intimidating as well. That's intimidating, I think, for kids and for people that you're trying to get them to open up on a personal basis and share their life story with you. It's intimidating to have, a plethora of gear and lights and all this stuff that feels like it's a little, yeah, taking over kind of.
Completely, because it was only last week I said on a job I was working on that it's better we have a smaller camera and less gear because it can be intimidating, especially if you are interviewing and making a documentary with kids or it's not even just kids, like anyone. Some people can get
Yeah.
very intimidated by it all. So I echo your thoughts, and I'll certainly be posting this clip out of the whole documentary to promote the documentary, which I can't wait to do because it's going so well, this podcast that we're doing now. And also, one question I must ask is, what focal length did you use for your lens or lenses? Because one of the problems I've been in, and many other people listening to this podcast, is when you have, say, for example, a Blackmagic Pocket cinema camera, 4K, 6K, or whatever, and you might only have cine lenses So you're constantly going from a 12 millimeter to a 50 millimeter to a 35 millimeter to 80 millimeter, and all those changes and problems with that doesn't help the workflow on the documentary. So I'd ask again,
Totally.
what focal length did you use for your lenses on this documentary?
I think for a lot of the run and gun, I love the Canon 24-70 lens.
Great.
I think that's a really versatile lens that you can really use in so many situations. So definitely for the run and gun, when we weren't stabilized, that was really our go-to lens. Also the 16 to 35, especially if we had two cameras, if we were two camera team, then those would be our non-stabilized two lenses that we would use. For the interviews, the same thing, the 24-70 would always just seem to be always in the mix. And our second camera often was a 70-200, but obviously always on a tripod. But I love the focal length of I love the depth of field that you get with the 70-200 for interviews. I think it's a really beautiful lens for just that B camera shot. I think you can get really cool looking shots with that. But the 24-70 definitely my powerhouse lens.
It's a great lens, and I agree with you with the focal length from the other lens about the shallow depth of field you can get, especially for interviews. It just looks amazing, and it looked amazing.
Yeah.
So
Thanks.
you're clearly very committed to environmental issues and social justice, which is brilliant. So how do you balance your personal beliefs with the professional need to create an engaging and unbiased narrative in some of your other work?
Yeah, and Gov one of our main goals was for it to be unbiased. I didn't want this to be a like Democrats versus Republicans or liberals versus conservatives kind of story. That was very important to me because this lawsuit, the story dictated that. And it's because, regardless of what my beliefs are or my value system, obviously I care very deeply about climate justice. And I know that the facts are true. And so I'm very concerned about our future and what kind of future my daughter is going to be living in, et cetera. So putting that aside, the lawsuit is based on decades of government actions, regardless of which political party. So it was very important with the story to be able to present that in a way that was bipartisan, right? That wasn't pitting one party against the other or one mindset against the other. Obviously, there's still people who don't believe in climate change. It's all bogus and they're not going to listen anyway. But I think what really resonated with a lot of people was this lawsuit, the beginning of the story, this lawsuit was against the Obama administration. And we did not tiptoe around what the Carter administration did. We really tried to be equal and fair to what the various political administrations had done. And while the Trump administration did inherit the case, and now it's with President Biden, and the Trump administration was so much worse in terms of the environmental policies than any other presidency before that. So that was, but we also didn't spend a lot of time on President Trump or on that part of the story. We were really trying to portray, historically what has happened, the decades of policies and government actions that have gotten us into this mess. So we also did test groups when we were in rough cut and cut screening. We had unknown folks, people that we didn't know. We had people helping us pick test audiences, and we did screens. So we had people, it was like retired folks down to kids from all different political persuasions and backgrounds, so that we could really get a sense of how the film was resonating and whether or not it felt, I don't know, swayed in one direction or not or another. And so that was really helpful for us in trying to create as much of a neutral, unbiased story as possible and really stick with the fact. Obviously, there's always the filmmaker's lens. It's right. I'm the one who's telling the story and I'm the one who's making the editorial and storytelling choices. but there was a lot of effort that went into not placing my value system onto this and really trying to stick with the story and what the kids' value system was and what they were fighting for, and to try to present that as objectively as possible.
So it looks like, from what I can tell, there will be a presidential election coming up somewhat soon. How do you think environmental activism in film will change depending on who becomes the next president?
I think that the last couple decades have dictated the state we're in with environmental activism. Regardless of which party has been in power, we've seen incredible environmental degradation. And with climate change being, really at the forefront of this, what is a humanitarian crisis. And I don't think, whether it's a party that's actively promoting the fossil fuel industry and supporting them, or whether it's a presidency and party such as Biden, who has definitely made commitments to climate action, but is still promoting and supporting fossil fuel infrastructure and development. The point is that we're not moving fast enough in the right direction. And so the need is so present and continues to grow. So I don't think, obviously, I think it's going to be worse with one president than with another, simply because of what they have stated and what they believe in and what their value systems are. But this need to tell these stories and to activate an audience, I think, is going to be there regardless, unfortunately, because we just are so many people on the planet doing so much awfulness to the environment, that the need is there, and it's not going away.
What advice would you give to future filmmakers considering a unique journey from science to filmmaking?
I would say go for it. It's been it's been a challenging transition, and it's a challenge right now. It's really challenging to be in the film industry. Things are tough. The getting a project off the ground, getting it commissioned, the funding is super challenging. We've seen, and especially in the impact filmmaking world, during my post-production process, my main production partner, Vulcan Productions, whose focus was on social impact films, they shut down. We just found out this week that Participant Media is shutting down. And these were two
Wow.
really big, really, really big forces in social impact film and using film for change. And they understood what impact campaigns looked like, and how to create them and how to use film to create change. And I feel like that the support and the resources for that continues to narrow. So I'm not shy to say that it's a difficult and a challenging field, but it's also super rewarding. And I think if someone wants to do that and they want to go out and tell stories, do it, but also, work with other people and collaborate. I think the collaborations for me have been the biggest learning platforms for me, is working with other people on other projects and collaborating and being challenged, having your own, you know, ideas and your own concepts challenged in a way to push you as a storyteller. I think that's super important.
Are you able to elaborate why they closed down? Like what exactly happened?
They made the decision in May of 2020, so it was in part because of COVID. The entire team, they let go like more than half of the team in May, and then there was like subsequent layoffs throughout that year, and then the last of the team finally left in February of 2021, and that was my team, and luckily Vulcan decided to continue to support Youth Gov through the end, which was amazing because I know that a lot of filmmakers lost that support. And so we were really fortunate to have that. But we did lose our impact partner. They were going to be our big impact partner. So that was pretty difficult. I don't, and Participant Media, they just made this announcement this last week. I'm not exactly sure what decision making went into that. And I know Jeff Scholes, said he wants to go in a different direction. And while participant has been very rewarding, I think the film industry in general is really challenging. I know that they made, the number of hit films that they had over the last few years had declined. I don't know if that's a measure of funding or of the difficulty in distribution, but yeah, it's pretty challenging right now.
How do you see your work evolving to address the ever-changing landscape of environmental and social justice?
I would love to continue to work in this realm. I'm spending a lot more time these days down in Costa Rica, and
Nice.
very I'm very curious about a lot of the environmental stories down here. I think there's social justice work to do down here and not a lot of resources for doing that storytelling. So I'm really curious to, connect with filmmakers here in the area or storytellers here in the area and try to help promote some of the needed, changes and efforts that's needed. Even though you think about Costa Rica as being super eco-friendly, conservation-minded country, there's actually a lot of environmental destruction going on here and unsustainable development and issues such as that. And I'm very drawn to work in that realm and help to tell those stories. So we'll see. But I'm not, I'm definitely this is where my passion is and that's what speaks to my heartstrings. I've worked on a lot of other projects, but I'm kind of always drawn back to kind of the justice realm and the little guy and the person who's up against these huge obstacles and challenges and has their heart in the right place.
And lastly, what can we see next from you?
Well, like I said, I'm right now kind of trying to, research some of the stories here in Costa Rica and figure out where I can go with that. UC Gov had like a long work period for me after the Netflix release in 2021. In 2022, we had a PBS release here nationwide in the US. And that was a lot of work for me to get out on that distribution platform. And we're still doing film festivals. I actually, just before I got on here, I did a Q&A with a film festival in India. Every year, it seems like as when early rolls around, UC Gov seems to kind of get a new life again. So I still have been, fairly involved with promoting the film and getting that out there. And because the case is still ongoing and hopefully will go to trial at some point soon, I think that also helps to continue the life of the film and the desire for audiences to screen this and to do community engagement. So yeah, I just trying to get some other projects off the ground. I've got several in development. I'm actually right now helping produce a narrative feature that has an environmental justice element to it, but it's going to be my first narrative that I've worked on, and I'm kind of excited about the creative aspect of that, of being able to tell the story that we want to tell, and create that story, but also to have that environmental justice component in it, and figure out how to tell the story in a different way.
Excellent. That sounds exciting, and good luck. Christy, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, and we'll definitely speak soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Damien. I really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for all you do to help elevate the voices of the filmmakers and the work that we're doing. These conversations are really important.